what about the women who do it? You're the one who does it, or else you wouldn't say, well, women do it too.
We've been living in sin so long, all the feels are gone.
When women talk about their lived experiences, when we start talking about things that men do, and when men turn around and their first reaction is, well, women do it too, 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, they're the ones who are doing the things that we're talking about. Why do you think that the divorce rate is increasing? Why do you think the amount of women who are filing for divorce is increasing? There's too many women that are out here that are talking about why they have left their partners. You haven't paid attention to anything that women are saying as to why they're fucking leaving because you want to say, well, women do it too. Obviously not, because men aren't leaving them. Men aren't sitting there saying, well, I'm going to divorce you because you're dismissing me. No.
Oh boy. Let's unpack these lies from women who look for and receive social validation for repeating them. Today I'm breaking down women's conflict escalation and their perpetuation for physical violence using an example that surfaced just this past week and what decades of research say about it. As many of you have already learned, actor Jerry O'Connell says that his wife and daughters, quote, became physical with him on election night 2024. And while media, podcasters, and reaction channels are talking about it, nobody is discussing what that actually means. So I'm going to break down women's roles in interpersonal violence in 3 parts, as I mentioned, grounded in what the research has shown for dozens of years. First, what O'Connell's statements actually tell us about men who are abused and what the data say about female-perpetuated aggression. Then what he actually said that led to the incident, and why his wife and daughter's responses were clearly over the line. And finally, what it means when physical abuse plays out in front of 2 teenage daughters and gets reinforced in the home. This is also one of those videos that gives you something most people will not. Actual evidence that you can use when somebody claims that domestic violence is uniquely or overwhelmingly male.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
For each of the 3 parts of this video, I'll play the short clip of Jerry O'Connell's statements when he recently spoke with Bill Maher on Club Random, starting with this one in which he stated what happened.
So I'm going to tell you about a bit of, how I say this, will I stay married? My wife and daughters, without saying anything, became physical with me. They were filled with rage. So if I am being careful with you in how I say things, yes, I live in California. I live with not 1, not 2, but 3 people who, if I made any kind of joke, they would, they'd become very angry with me, you know?
Notice that when O'Connell describes what happened that night, he uses a very specific phrase. He says that his wife and his 2 daughters, again, quote, became physical. And that wording is very loaded and intentionally vague. He doesn't describe what they actually did, whether it was hitting, shoving, or throwing lamps at him. He chooses a phrase that acknowledges escalation without defining it, potentially to downgrade the incident for fear of backlash from his wife and daughters, or maybe even to reduce any embarrassment on his own behalf. So it's controlled language, and he signals that control before even saying what happened. He makes it clear that he has to be careful about how he approaches this subject, which tells us that there's likely more behind it than he's actually willing to put on record. But then he immediately follows with something that removes any ambiguity about his tone. He says that they were filled with rage. So now we're not looking at something incidental or simply sarcastic. We're looking at physical escalation driven by anger and rage. And that combination is the entire point. We don't need to know the exact behavior to understand what happened. The issue isn't whether it was a snap or a slap in the moment or something more. The issue is that physical abuse by a woman, that's his wife, and two teenagers, his daughters, on their husband and their father in a moment of emotional intensity, and he describes it in a way that softens it. He says it, he qualifies it, and then he simply moves on as if it's really no big deal. There's no pause, no acknowledging that he'd been physically abused by 3 women in his own home. No mention of it as a serious problem or indication that it was challenged or addressed on his behalf. It's presented as part of the experience, something that he had to navigate rather than something that fundamentally should never have happened. And that normalization is textbook from victims of physical abuse. So let's talk a little bit about the broader research, because this isn't some rare isolated situation. Female perpetuated aggression in relationships is well documented, although women refuse to admit that it ever happens at all. And it shows up at meaningful rates across thousands of studies. Research has consistently shown that women report committing physical violence in intimate relationships at comparable and sometimes even higher rates than men, with one large data set showing just over 28% of women versus 21% of men reporting perpetuation. And again, this is by women's own admission when responding in research studies. It's not nearly as one-sided as women are led to believe or would have us believe. And furthermore, a substantial portion of the literature shows that intimate partner violence is often bidirectional, not unilateral, meaning both partners report engaging in aggression within the same relationship. By the way, I forgot to mention, I will put links for all of my sources in the description. Feel free to go down there and get them if you like. We'll also put overlay images of the research articles and things like that as I go along as well. I always recommend using Google Scholar. If you want to look up research, get copies for yourself. Many times you can get the PDFs downloaded directly from there. So Google Scholar is a good source. Okay, so in some dating and college samples, about 1/3 of men and women both report perpetuating violence in the past year, which points to patterns of escalation rather than a single aggressor model. When we expand the definition of aggression to include things like verbal aggression or coercive behavior, reported rates for women can climb even higher. In some studies, such as Williams and Fries in 2008, have found female perpetuation ranging from roughly 1/3 of cases to more than 50%, depending on how aggression is measured and how they define it. Additionally, in a study of 403 participants across multiple conflict scenarios, women showed a greater tendency than men to escalate conflict in its initial stages, including higher likelihood of engaging in behaviors aimed at intensifying or advancing the disagreement. That comes from a 2018 study that I'll put up on the screen here. Even in official records where we might expect underreporting in certain directions, women still make up a substantial portion of identified offenders. For example, military and registry data have shown women accounting for roughly 23 to 33% of domestic violence offenders. Yet reviews of published literature have explicitly noted that domestic violence has often been framed as exclusively male-initiated, even when the data shows a more complex system and is often two-sided. So when we refer back to O'Connell's phrasing, that's the context you're hearing in. It's the watered-down bullshit that comes from academia and politicians, and men feel like they're obligated to then reinforce, oh, it was just this, it was just that. A man describing physical aggression directed at him and signaling that he's censoring himself, and then softens the language, and then moves on as if it's just part of the normal situation. And honestly, the takeaway is not hidden in the details that he left out. It's in how easily that line gets crossed, how quickly it gets normalized once it is. Now let's turn to what actually led to this alleged abuse, because the contrast between the action and the reaction is really hard to ignore.
I was watching late at night the returns, and I'll be honest with you, I didn't think Trump was going to win. I live in California. I didn't think he was going to win. From what I was hearing,
I didn't either.
I think he was going to win.
No,
This is where I live, you know?
Yeah.
I said something along the lines of like, there was no planning, this is what they get. there should have been a primary. I said something along those lines, you know? Like I was just spitballing ideas as to, it was a shock, you know? My wife and daughters, without saying anything, became physical with me. They were filled with rage.
O'Connor explicitly frames his own comments at that time as spitballing ideas. According to him, he didn't make a declaration or independent opinion about the election results. He wasn't taking a hard ideological stance, and if he's to be believed, he didn't even try to provoke anyone. He was apparently just simply talking through a thought in real time, which is exactly how most normal conversations unfold. He specifically said that there should have been a primary in the presidential election by the Democratic Party. And by the way, the fact that he said there should have been a primary convinces me that he actually holds the same political views as his wife and daughters, who were not even old enough to vote at by that time, by the way. Just thought about that. But regardless, his comments were not ideological extremism or inflammatory at all. Hell, it's not even controversial. Everyone on both sides of the aisle was thinking the same thing at the time. There should have been a primary for the Democratic Party. It's a process-level critique that he made about a political party and how they handled its own decision-making, and it sits firmly in the category of mild procedural disagreement. The reason that this is important is because it removes the usual justifications that abusers often rely on. He didn't insult anyone or celebrate anything. All he did was question a political strategy, and the response that he received was alleged physical abuse by his wife and 2 teenage daughters. So the reaction was not to his aggression in the first place. It was to something that they simply didn't want to hear. And within that context, a growing body of work in political psychology shows that disagreements of this type are increasingly filtered through identity rather than evaluated on content. Let me explain. Studies on emotional polarization, like those from Wagner in 2021 and Mason in 2018, have found that women, on average, report higher levels of hostility toward political opponents, driven in part by a stronger partisan identification and deeper emotional attachment to political issues. A more recent analysis by Green in 2023, that's just a couple of years ago, extends our understanding, showing that political disagreement is no longer treated as a difference of opinion, but as a moral violation, which then increases the likelihood that people see punitive or aggressive responses as justified. So when politics become identity, disagreement stops being a discussion or learning opportunity and starts being treated like a moral offense. Now, this premise is based on the possibility that Jerry has different political beliefs than his wife. But as I mentioned, I'm not convinced that that's true. They actually hold the same, likely hold the same political beliefs. But the shift from discussion to moral offense helps explain how something as mild as questioning a political strategy can trigger a disproportionate reaction. But it doesn't stop there. Additional research on relationship dynamics shows that in many cases, women are more likely to drive that initial escalation phase, as I mentioned earlier. And the type of aggression matters as well. For example, research published in 2000, I believe, and in 2006 shows women's aggression is more strongly associated with hostility, meaning a sustained negative evaluation of the victim rather than a momentary emotional spike. And that distinction is important here in this instance because nothing O'Connell describes would reasonably trigger acute anger. As I mentioned, there was no insult, no attack, no direct provocation on his behalf. I mean, I could go on here for hours on this topic because there's a ton of literature about political hostility driven by status and group alignment and how people use those types of beliefs to justify their physical aggression. Maybe I'll dive into that another time, but let's move on to perhaps the most unsettling part of this sad story.
My wife and daughters, without saying anything, became physical with me. They were filled with rage.
For me, the biggest issue here is not just what had allegedly happened. It's where it happened and who was involved. This was not a private argument between two adults. It was a household environment in which a husband and father is describing his wife and two teenage daughters becoming physical with him. And that's really shitty, because behavior inside the home doesn't stay stuck in that moment, never to be thought of again. It gets observed, reinforced, and often repeated. At the time, I believe O'Connell's daughters were just turning 16 years old. That's not early childhood where behavior is absorbed passively or maybe it's not understood. That's mid-adolescence, a time at which identity, boundaries, and everything, including interpersonal norms, are all actively being formed and solidified. What children at that age see modeled in marriages and in their home becomes part of how they understand conflict, authority, and acceptable behavior by other people. In this area, social learning theory has long established that individuals learn behavior through observation, imitation, and reinforcement, especially within the family unit. Much of social learning theory comes from Albert Bandura. For those of you who are interested in developmental psychology, I think he's a great place to start. The theory helps us understand that when aggression is modeled by a parent and not meaningfully challenged or corrected, it increases the likelihood that the behavior will be adopted by those children. And research has found that children who are more exposed to interparental aggression are more significantly likely to engage in aggressive behaviors themselves, both within the family and their own future relationships. Again, sources are in the video description for those who want them. And normalization is the key issue here, because what's modeled in this instance appears to be immediate escalation. It's the idea that when your own father says something you don't like, physical aggression is an acceptable response. Even longitudinal research, such as that by Capaldi and colleagues in 2012, has shown that exposure to parental aggression is associated with higher rates of perpetuation in later romantic relationships. That means that the same dynamics tend to repeat across generations rather than staying contained in one household. So what those teen girls experienced in that moment is a template. And the presence of multiple participants reinforces it even further. When aggression is not only modeled by a parent, but joined by siblings, it creates a kind of group validation, if you would. And we all know how much women love to give and receive validation amongst themselves. The behavior is collectively reinforced, which increases the likelihood that it's perceived as justified rather than excessive. And it also provides diffusion of responsibility. They can all claim that the others were responsible, right? I didn't start it. I didn't do it. She's the one that hit him. She's the one that did that. So there's no accountability. Again, just like the previous topic, I could also go on about this topic forever. So let's leave the modeling of behavior right there for now and move on to what this really means for men. At some point, the question has to stop being what happened that night and what happens next. Because Jerry O'Connell is not a guy without options. He's 52 years old. He's successful, very financially secure, and he's publicly recognizable, probably has tons of friends. And his wife is the same. This is not a situation in which he's dependent on her for anything. This is a man with full agency. And even in that position, what we see is hesitation. He doesn't describe the incident in detail. He softens the language, as I mentioned, and he moves past it quickly. And he immediately pivots to how careful he has to be with what he says about what happened in his own home. So the real question is not just what happened. It's much more than that. So let's start with some obvious questions, such as, should he have reported it? In theory, yes. But in reality, that opens up a chain of consequences that most men already understand instinctively. Reporting it leads to police involvement, public scrutiny, potential career fallout, and a narrative that is very, very difficult to control, especially in the public eye. Even if nothing comes of it legally, the social framing is already set before the facts are given. That's why so many men don't go that route, why they don't report it. And here's another question. Should he just leave? Again, in theory, I would say yes, get the fuck out. But then he's dealing with a 17-year-old marriage, 2 teenage twin daughters, shared social circles and career moves, public image fallout, and financial entanglement that will probably likely cost him a bunch of money. And more importantly, he wouldn't be leaving a single incident. He'd be leaving everything he built. Divorce at that level isn't just a personal decision. It's a public event with long-term consequences and extremely large financial considerations. So that option gets avoided, and it's why many men never leave their marriages. In fact, only about 20% of the time, it's men. Because they'll get raked, and they have to start all over again when they do leave. So what's left? Really, the only option left is to just suck it up and adapt to it. And you can hear that in what O'Connell says. He filters his language, as I mentioned, and he avoids the details. Because he understands the cost of conflict. Even when it's his wife and his daughters who allegedly got physical with him. Ultimately, none of this is really about the moment of aggression. It's about the behavioral shift that follows it. Because once escalation happens, the dynamic changes, whether it's one incident and whether it's addressed or not. And it never does go away. You don't need multiple instances or constant aggression. You only need the memory of it the first time it happens. And in this case, it didn't stay private. And there has been extreme public coverage in the media. Speaking about it publicly introduces more dynamics, such as his wife hearing about it, his daughters hearing about it, their social circles now likely gossiping about it behind their backs, all of which creates more pressure. So we end up with a potential situation in which the original event isn't addressed directly, the adaptation becomes permanent, and the only time it surfaces is when it slips out in public. But I'd love to hear about what many of you have done or what you would do in the situation. Report it, leave her, confront it, suck it up and just move on within that marriage. Let me know your comments. And listen, don't think I'm letting O'Connell off the hook here. Not even close. Because this is not the first time he's dealt with behavior like this from his wife. And that's where his lack of standing up for himself gets a lot more uncomfortable. So I'm doing a separate breakdown on what kind of man ends up in this position, why it happens, and why marriages and relationships like this are already finished, even if not formally. That full uncensored video is on Patreon, and the link for that is in the description. I'll see you there.